Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate the organizers, the people who traveled so far or not, and the people here who I've studied with in the past. It's great to see some of you. I don't get to see you often enough. So, as you can see, I'm talking about a particular form of dialogue, although I want to have in the background the fact that this form of dialogue can inform a broader range of dialogues. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. I thought about doing this project. I consider issues of race and gender, economic status, religion, disability, and so forth. I consider them as intractable in the sense that this conference has used that term. A colleague who I appreciate very much, Barbara Love, has said, racism had a beginning, so it can have an end. Of course, that's, a very long-range concept, but I don't believe intractable means impossible, as many of you have stated. Intergroup dialogue is one intervention in seemingly intractable conflicts, and this investigation grows from a dissonance of really believing in dialogue, but also really listening carefully to some of the serious critiques and agreeing with a number of them. So I wanted to look into how valid are these critiques, what can be done, can we actually have fair dialogue? Just to position myself a little bit, I'm an academic and an activist. I've been co-facilitating dialogues here at SU for 11 years. I've done race and ethnicity, gender, religion, and I'm also very involved in the activist community in the Peace Council. You heard a little bit about this morning from Noon, the Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation. I'm also, probably my most intensive activism is around anti-nuclear work. Also racial justice and solidarity, and with many groups around the community that I try to show up for, even though it's always difficult. This presentation looks at the roots and the role of dialogue and conflict resolution. I don't go into conflict resolution very much because that's the expertise of most of the people in this room. Then I look at the critiques of dialogue, and I define intergroup dialogue, and I'm talking specifically in this paper about the academic intergroup dialogue that began at the University of Michigan in 2004 and has been part of a 9-university study that I'll mention a little bit more when I talk about the research. But I will talk about strategies of dialogue that I feel do address many of the critiques, at least strategies of this form of dialogue. And then, of course, there's lots of research that could be done in the future. Both conflict resolution and IGD have a sort of root in Alport's contact theory, but one of the basic requirements of this theory is equal status, which, of course, all of the things I listed, most of the conflicts we've talked about, that is not a condition that we can count on. But many researchers and practitioners have tried to address the issue of asymmetry in conflict. Several authors talk about the importance of civil society in conflict transformation, and besides the ones I list here, I had a great conversation with Galia, who spoke of that, and Ezra's work, and a number of you have addressed that. And here, just some quotes that establish the importance of conflict resolution and also of dialogue to change people. Someone you know quoted here. And also from the same 1989 book, so you can read this article from Richard Schwartz in the Intractable Conflicts book that you all received. So I want to say a little bit about the critiques of dialogue. I think that Hani kind of mentioned this first one where some people might be critical of him even being here, right? And we appreciate that you're here and think that that premise is something that needs to be overcome. A number of people have spoken about the possibility that dialogue can maintain or even reinscribe oppressive power relationships. And also that dialogue can prioritize friendship over political change. And I have seen that kind of dialogue quite a bit and worry about it. Not just, there's nothing wrong with friendship. It's a great first step. But if it stops at that level, it's not going to touch on the structural issues that keep it in place. And that means that people think they're doing something great, but they're not really doing it. And some further dangers in terms of tokenizing, just being nice cultural exchange, which again is great, but not enough. Or this idea of colonizing, which maintains this individual approach without attending to the contexts in larger structures. And when I asked Ezra this morning about the term normalization, I brought it up because I've been hearing that term a lot lately. And there are a number of meanings that I came across. The Rios and Stewart article is really referring in general to any kind of oppression, and it just keeps privilege invisible and makes it look like there's equal status when there really isn't, or glossing over the power asymmetries as if the dialogue is between equals, accepting the status quo without taking action. And this last piece is from the, I think I've got the initials right, the Palestine Academic Cultural Boycott of Israel, which says that in relation to Israel-Palestine, if a dialogue doesn't aim to resist the occupation, then it's not legitimate. And I kind of addressed this right from the beginning before going into the ways that dialogue addresses the other factors, because I don't think any of us expect to come into a dialogue and 100% agree. And if we aren't going to have a dialogue unless we agree, I find that I kind of feel like we don't even need to talk about this concern. We need to know about it and we need to work with it, but I'm not looking for the remedies in the same way that I'm looking for remedies of the other factors. And I just wanted to mention one situation with John Paul Lederach, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, in terms of conflict resolution in Latin America, where people were critical of him, of the idea that conflict resolution could solve problems that they've been dealing with for a very long time, or possibly even be a cover-up for just maintaining the status quo. And he very much validated those concerns and worked on projects, worked on the idea of conflict transformation. Thank you. So I think in that spirit, I want to also work on the idea of dialogue and of addressing the concerns while trying to take dialogue further. So defining intergroup dialogue, and this is the academic program now I'm defining. It's a face-to-face facilitated learning experience adapted for college courses. There are certainly a number of intergroup dialogues that are community-level dialogues. It brings together students of different social identities over a sustained period to understand commonalities and differences. And it examines the impact of social inequalities, exploring ways of working together towards greater equality and justice. It moves from low risk to higher risk. Power relations and social structures are central to what is studied. And affective learning is also considered important, and this is a place where it deviates from a lot of college courses where affect is kept out of the classroom. So I'm going to name 3 broad areas that are strategies for accounting for power in dialogue and addressing some of the critiques. And the first strategy is just the way the classes are put together. So in the beginning of the semester, first of all, classes are small, 12 to 18 students. They're also formulated by the identity that is the main focus of the class, although all of the dialogues are intersectional. But in a race dialogue, half the class is so-called white people, half is people of color, and of course there's the complexity of many combinations thereof, but we try to have some degree of balance there, which already introduces some complications, of course. And in the very beginning, we develop guidelines which help the class to consider power dynamics. They develop the guidelines collaboratively. And one really important piece that's thought about in this process is balancing the idea of safety, that this is a safe place, or we now talk about safer places because we can't completely make it safe, but that also we're not going to make progress if we don't take risks. So it's trying to balance those things. The curriculum of dialogue is the second strategy. A number of different pieces of the curriculum are very much designed with the idea of bringing people together across power differences. So the first, let's see. Okay, somehow I missed the stages. Okay, yeah, so the curriculum is organized in 4 stages. The first stage is about developing the dialogue skills, the listening, the careful sending of messages, and building relationships of trust. The second part is about understanding social identities and the role of social structures and institutions in creating and maintaining inequality. Then in the third stage, which is around the 6th, 7th, 8th week, somewhere in there, we finally have our dialogues around really controversial topics. And then in the 4th stage, planning and enacting collaboration for social justice, so an action project. So I'll say a little more about each of these stages. In stage 1, we talked about the dialogue skills, also developing a deeper understanding of identity, one's own identity and the identities of other students in the class. Things like identity as it's ascribed to us when people look at us as compared to how we see ourselves, identities that are targeted or dominant, and that most people have some of each. It's not a monolithic identity. And we use different exercises of filling out identity wheels to distinguish the personal and social identities. And by the end of this stage, students share personal narratives. We're at that phase right now in the class that I'm teaching, and it's always a very intense, often emotional point in the class, where students really share what it means to be a person of their identity, experiences they've had, and it really helps students to make connections with one another. So stage 2, we start to put this in a larger context of social institutions, looking at patterns of fact, recognizing the workings of power. And one of the questions that I think my students get sometimes tired of hearing me say is, so how is power operating in this situation? What does power have to do with the fact that all the people who are talking right now are white, or something along those lines? And one of the sort of key activities is what we call the web of oppression and privilege. And it's a collection of facts about different identities and their experiences in different social institutions. So it really is organized like a web. This is, we originally bought a, yarn web that was meant for Halloween, right? And attached these cards with facts on it, arranged in institutions. So different pie shapes refer to the media, the education system, the government, and so forth. Also within stage 2, we have caucus groups, where students meet with others of their identity. And it's at this point that they start seeing that although they've developed friendships, that may not be the whole story. And they often notice that they'll say things in the caucus groups that they didn't say to one another in the larger group with the other half of the class. And again, those power questions come into play. And then they, after having these discussions, they sit in what we call fish bowls, where one group, where one group is on the outside, the other is on the inside, and they listen to one another. And they analyze the tensions in those friendships. And of course, I'm going to have to hurry through a little bit of power and caucus groups, but then they talk about the hot topics. And again, it's who's speaking, how authority is claimed, how power is operating, observing what are the dominant narratives, noticing what narratives are missing from the conversation. And then the last stage, they work across different identities to develop an action project. And to do that, they think about alliances, they look at models of social justice action, and they either create a new activity or participate in one that's already ongoing. And there's readings and all the way along that help create the larger context, and they write to reflect on all of this. The third strategy is co-facilitation. Every intergroup dialogue is co-facilitated by 2 facilitators of differing identities. And a lot of modeling takes place. And I think this concept of multi-partial facilitation is extremely important. We don't claim to be impartial, but we bring in our different identities, ask students to bring in their own experiences and identities, and make space for the counter-narratives that often aren't heard. So I've listed some research. I'm just going to read the lines that are emphasized here, that research shows that these strategies do work in bringing about more intergroup collaboration and engagement, in increasing awareness about structural power relations, in developing relationships that translate into personal and collective action, a number of things about action and civic engagement, and a little bit more on the engagement piece. And I'll be glad to share more of this. In conclusion, I would say that intergroup dialogue addresses the critiques. Of course, it's imperfect. We are continually trying to improve our practice, but we expose power relations through the various aspects of the course. We disrupt the idea of coexistence or friendship and really replace this whole idea of coexistence with co-resistance, and it emphasizes action. And I think there's lots of room for future research, and I would just end by saying let's have a dialogue about dialogue when we have time for questions.